Welcome to Promote Profit Publish. I'm your host, Juliet Clark, and today's guest is one of our authors, and you're actually going to hear from him today about the book he released last month, and he has a new one coming out in February. So super excited about both of them because when you look at what he's doing, it just makes so much sense. But before we get started, I want to remind you guys, we have a sale, we have a bundle. And that bundle is designed to help you market like a literary rock star. You can go over to authorbuzzbuilders.com. We have 6 courses for you guys, normally a $3,000 value, but through 12/31, we are offering it for $997. Authorbuzzbuilders.com. So what's in it? Content development, social media development for authors, email marketing for authors, AI platform building, build your author avatar. And there's one more, and I can never remember the other one, but it's all super good stuff. I think platform planning. Anyway, yeah, super good stuff will help you be able to put together your funnels. I mean, I know that's sort of a dirty word for authors, but the truth is you need them to gather an audience. So it's a must have for any author out there. And you get this set up before, like way before that book comes out, because there are literally 100,000 or more books that come out every single month. So if you're thinking you don't need to do this work and your book will just sell, chances are it won't. So again, authorbuzzbuilders.com. Grab that, make it your 2025 guidebook, and learn the ins and outs of putting all this marketing together. So today's guest is Dr. Greg Stewart, and he lives in Rockwall, Texas, and is currently a full-time telehealth counselor, executive coach, and consultant. He has a BA in organizational leadership, a master's in divinity, and an MA in counseling, and a PhD in counselor education and supervision. His dissertation was the relationship of emotional intelligence to job satisfaction and organizational commitment. And these books are just, I can't even tell you, they are so amazing because if you're having communication problems or, you're in some sort of dysfunctional pattern, this is really going to be the key to doing the work, to getting rid of what's no longer serving you. So stay tuned for Greg. Greg, welcome.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Excellent.
Look at you. You voted. Good for you. So I'm really excited to talk about your book because it's such common sense for those people who really want to heal conflict in their lives and, whatever dysfunctional relationships. And we all have them, but some of us hold on to those things because they serve us until they do not. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a variety of reasons why, underneath that, why we hold on to our negative emotions, right? But obviously, I write in the book that it ends up hurting us trying to achieve our goal, for sure, right? Because it doesn't pass the test of rational, healthy, wise, and right. But yeah, there's a lot of reasons why we hold on to those negative emotions when we shouldn't.
Yeah, no, there definitely is. So, can you summarize like the core message of the book and what inspired you to write it?
All right, so I'll begin with the former or the latter question first. What inspired me to write it is simply my culmination of 30 years of work with clients. And I came up with the iCubed principle of information, interpretation, intensity, just as a kind of a walkthrough of how to, assess situations. Like 20 years ago, and ever since I said, man, I love this idea and it would make a good book. But of course, time passes and the like. So it came from a culmination where I always say this book, ran through the system of Greg first. So when I give the clients, the information in the book about emotional management and the deeper stuff about identity, value, and worth and working through trauma, it's all gone through my own personal application because I begin the book with you can't impart what you don't possess. And so I believe in that I need to be able, when I advise others on how to, heal, respond to emotions and the like, I better have applied it myself. So basically the book is about our emotional experiences, right? So I get into the psychology of what emotions are. We have emotional goals, and then in order to achieve those emotional goals, we pick a path to achieve the emotional goal. And the emotional goal is always good, but we have to assess the path to see if it's rational, healthy, wise, or right. Like most simple example is when I'm experiencing a lot of stress. I want to reduce the stress, emotional goal. I start drinking alcohol to cope. Well, that's not a rational, healthy, wise, and right path.
Mhm.
So distinguishing that, and then um, kind of figuring out that we have to like retrain our mental models, which is just standard like psychology stuff. But really, it goes into the amount of negative emotions that I kind of picture that we're standing outside the our house, and the house is our heart, and the in front of us are all these people that are triggering us. And so what we do is we just kind of camp there and just burn all this emotional energy processing them, right? Which that we may have something legitimate to address with them because they did do something wrong. However, the inflation, we should not have this much emotional energy. It's just way too high for the situation. And that is kind of our cue to figure out what is going on inside of us. So I say we got to turn around and walk into the front door of the house of our heart and figuring out what's going on. So I work through the emotions, insecurity, anxiety, fear, worry, anger, and depression. But other than that, in the basement is the deeper stuff like identity, value, and worth, because we can inflate emotions because we believe a lie about the situation, like I'll never get a job. Well, that inflates our emotion, right? But really, when let's say we're in relationship and somebody, confronts us or they say something negative about us, our emotion is inflated. Why? Because we take it personally. And when we take it personally, what is that saying? We're allowing it to impact our value and worth instead of dealing with the criticism or negativity on its face value, like, is this true or not true? We get defensive and it kind of expands, right? So we have to address identity, value, and worth. But then the other thing is over in the basement and in the corner of the cellar is trauma. And trauma, like, and I'm not talking about like official diagnosable trauma of threat of loss of life. It can be like trauma, any negative experience, like a divorce, loss of a job, that when we go into a situation, our mental models like scoop up the emotion from that experience and plop it on the situation. So we need to heal, right? So it's not just about emotional management. It's kind of going into, that's why it's, unlock the inner strength behind your negative emotions, because once you go in there and you start doing this healing work, and it's not just healing, it's empowerment and strengthening of your core identity, value, and worth. What that results in is, I literally say the goal is that you take all the power away from the environment, that nothing bothers me unless it should. So that's the end game, is to have absolute power and control. It's like emotional intelligence over our emotions but the pathway is hard, meaning dealing with the deeper stuff. That's like in a nutshell, long answer, but that's the nutshell of the book.
So that was my next question. Define emotional intelligence for us, because I think a lot of people, I remember at my daughter's work, something happened and her boss said, "You lack emotional intelligence." And she came home and told me, and I was like, the person who told you that you lack emotional intelligence lacks emotional
Emotional
intelligence per
intelligence,
se.
right?
So
Yeah.
can you give us a divide, tell us
Yeah.
what that means?
Right. So I did for my PhD, I did my dissertation on emotional intelligence, and the simplest definition that's obviously very accurate. It is simply being aware of emotions in self and others, and being able to manage the emotions in self and others. That's the most simple. So it's like a four square quadrant. The idea became popularized by Daniel Goleman back in 1995, when he wrote the book Emotional Intelligence, Why It Can Matter More Than IQ, because very, very smart people can do very, very dumb things, right? But the dumb is emotional, not IQ based, right? So then there's other schools of EI that has more to do with our IQ and critical thinking, which is fair. But really it's about that emotional management process, like being aware of my emotions, and not only that, why I have them. And that's the deeper stuff in my book. And then being able to manage my emotions. So I talk about the EI skills of impulse control and delay of gratification. along with the words like resiliency, which it's the emotional strength of not being bothered by small things, right? I'm resilient, I can persevere. And then tough mindedness, that my tough mindedness says that I'm not just going to respond emotionally, I'm going to think through it first. So it's like there's a bunch of different subcategories to EI, but it's related to self awareness and then self management and then others awareness, which I call it situational awareness, which I think is the most powerful piece of this because it's the brick wall. Like the situation calls out and says, hey, there is a right way, an effective way to respond to me, whatever the situation is. And we need to mold ourselves to it because it will not mold itself to us. So being able to critically think through, and this is more of the IQ piece, critically think through and read the situation, emotions and the like of the situation, and then being able to respond to it the most effectively, which is others management or relationship management or social intelligence, right?
So let me ask you a question about that. So I look around today and how do I say this? There's a couple things. So first of all, there are those people who can't wait to tell you how aware they are. Oh, I'm so aware, but then you observe them and it's obvious that those are words and they're so unaware of who they are and how they show up. Is that pretty typical? Because I just love to know how this all relates to personal growth because to me, that's someone in denial and there's no personal growth that's going to happen. And then the second part of that is the younger generations. We've been having a lot of discussions lately about how there seems to be this lack of critical thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Right.
they're completely running on emotion. So can you address those two? Like, can those people engage in personal growth in those states?
Yeah. So EI is so IQ, EQ. EI is it's almost like a skill set, and there are techniques to improve our EQ for sure. Where IQ comes into play is, you know, people with high IQs, because IQ is about processing speed. So it's
Mhm.
about rate of growth, right? So the answer is yes, everybody can grow in these things. Now, in the first couple of chapters of my book, it's almost like this is the prerequisite for all growth. Like, it doesn't matter who you are. The prerequisite for growth is basically understanding that our mental model, my mental model, is formed from, I could say DNA, which is my personality and my gender. Like men think differently than women. So DNA, life experiences, and personal choices, right? So it's just that data going into our minds, right? So it's basically made up of information, right? Data, facts, right? And then secondly, formulas. And those formulas are basically how to interpret the situation. Okay. And then recognizing that it was a long time ago, it was very easy for me to conclude that, I lack a lot of information for every situation. But secondly, my formulas for interpreting and processing things, it's cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. I don't trust my formulas. And it's that understanding of humility that the way I think might be right in areas, but I'm always very apprehensive to just automatically validate that the way I'm interpreting it is correct. And if you automatically assume that you're correct, then you're going to be much more resistant to change. That's one piece. So teachability is just being open to that my mental model needs some work. But then I say you have to be proactive in the teachability for this one other component called the blind area. And the blind area simply is things that you see about me that I don't see about myself. So if I don't see it about myself, how am I going to fix it?
Yes.
So proactively, I need to go to people and say, hey, help me grow because I need to grow. So I think our generation that we're experiencing now, that there is so much validation and encouragement poured into them. I think
Yes.
there's an automatic assumption that their mental model is a-okay,
Yeah.
right? Because of the second piece of emotions, that everything is about the emotional goal, right? So basically, I like joking around saying that the ultimate enemy is to feel bad, right? Because feeling bad like results in like depression and all this other stuff. But we've taken it way too far because negative emotions, which is the whole point of my book. So it's almost like people say, wait a minute, you made me feel bad. So that means you're bad,
Right? No.
right? Right. And not at all. So just the understanding that my mental model needs improvement. And then secondly, it's my emotions, however I feel, the end goal in any moment is I need to feel good. So if I don't feel good and you're making me feel bad, then you need to change, which is a lot like with the trans stuff today of that their entire emotional happiness is I need you to change you and approach me in such a way that you validate me.
Yes.
So I need your validation, your approval, your support. And in my book, it is just the opposite. I say we got to separate every other human being from my value and worth. Remove my happiness, my whatever, my emotional state is not contingent upon the environment. Right. So
Mhm.
that's what I think is happening in this generation. So when they have the emotional goal of love and empathy, which are good emotional goals, the emotional goals are always good. The pathways that they choose to get there, like let's say the trans, we're just like saying, hey, like just a couple of years ago, everybody on earth said, hey, this is not a rational, healthy, wise, and right path to achieve the emotional goal of love and empathy. But now, if we say, hey, this is not a rational, healthy, wise, and right path, our current culture has merged path with goal. So when we say, hey, this is not a healthy path, they're saying, wait a minute, you don't want me to achieve my goal of love. So that means you hate.
Right.
And
Yep.
that's where they merge it.
Yeah.
Absolutely, that's where they merge it, right? So we have to separate the emotional goal from the path. And that's another piece of it that everything you do to achieve, because the emotional goal is everything, whatever pathway you take to achieve love and empathy, hey, do it, right? And that's the huge weakness of our goal. So I like to talk about grace and truth, where we want to show grace and empathy, but grace and empathy without truth and boundaries is enablement, right?
Right.
But
Yes.
our culture has swung way this way. Why? Because honestly, and legitimately, we went through a season where it was truth and boundaries without grace and empathy is toxic. So
Mhm.
we all kind of a lot of us grew up in that feeling. So like,
Yeah.
whoa, that's not healthy. This is toxic. Where's the grace and empathy? So we, like everybody does, go from one extreme to another. And now it's just about grace and empathy. But thankfully, you see it happening. Our culture is starting to wake up from it. And I actually had a
Yes.
conversation with a gal yesterday who is a lesbian, and I talked about our culture where like even in that community, they're starting to show separation, saying,
Oh yeah.
"Hey, like gays against groomers,"
Yes.
because they're saying there is a moral line. Like this is too far, and we're now against. Now there's a moral line, whereas before it was just about that. So we're starting to see kind of like in a good way, like even the breakdown of DEI
Mhm.
in organizations, because we're realizing the ramifications from that only focusing over here is damaging a lot of people. So now it's going to start swinging the other way, hopefully.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And the conversations we've been having is this generation that experienced it also had social media, which is just a big validation loop for the most part. Like, hey, look at me, I posted this, and then comments. But the other is I don't think they're teaching critical thinking skills in school.
Mm.
And like I know our generation had, and so there's not that stop point where you can say, oh my God, my emotions are running wild. I don't have that critical thinking piece to like pull me back and say, am I, whoa, emotions, you're like going way overboard here. So
Right.
that's,
So yeah, critical thinking can be, labeled as like, objective thinking. So subjective is my opinion, my world, my beliefs, my whatever. But to look objectively is to kind of step outside of myself and say, Greg, you realize that, I understand why you're feeling the way you're feeling, but hey, that's the second part of, iCubed information interpretation. So the key thing with interpretation is, hey, is there any other way of thinking about it?
right.
Is there any other interpretation other than yours? And there's multiple truths, ways to look at it. And that's the critical thinking piece. Look at it objectively instead of just, validating the emotional experience, that the emotional experience is the litmus test for success. And so that's where our only like grade is. That's why, now, schools saying we don't fail kids. I mean, why? Because
Nailed
it
them.
makes them feel bad.
Okay.
Right. And that's what it's about, because it's just about, a breakdown of knowledge, objective truth. I mean, it's all related to like, just traditional, right? So what traditional links back to, traditional Christian values, religious values, which means objective truth. So in an answer to the limitations that God and the Bible puts on us, how do we get rid of those limitations? Well, we say that the subjective experience, like my truth is,
Oh,
right?
God, that
So we
drives me
pull
crazy.
away from that, and then it's about, then we put and then in order to do that, we put the focus on the subjective emotional experience as the moral compass,
Right.
right? I mean, it's just,
So
it's not.
it's really like making myself the core of the universe versus having a higher power
Right.
is kind of basically, I think, what you're saying.
Yeah.
So one part of your book that I love is you emphasize that negative emotions can be the catalyst for personal growth, which I know every time I go through a growth spurt, it's because
Yeah.
something negative has happened and I've just been like, I can't live like this anymore.
Yeah.
So you expound on that?
Yep. Okay. So, all right. So, for instance, on my personal story, so I talk about in the book that back in 2011, I had an emotional affair, right? And out of that, because I was a pastor and a marriage counselor, my complaint was that I felt like I pursued everybody harder than they pursued me. Well, it was out of that gap of experience, like, well, why aren't people pursuing me? I had these negative emotions, which then related to, am I not worth being pursued? Am I missing something about myself? And then it turned into where the whole identity, value, and worth discussion of, I need other people to pursue me and validate me to have a solid value and worth, right? And so when recognizing that the negative emotions were not going away and they could not go away, why? Because those negative emotions became contingent upon something I did not have control over.
Right.
So the issue of the negative emotions, and how do I solve these negative emotions? Well, it is out of me granting the solution, the control to the environment, which I had no control over, in order for me to feel better. So something was off there. So in the process of walking into the negative emotions, and like insecurity is a great one. So if, I'm insecure because, let's say, you criticize me and I get defensive. And I used to, in the book I talk about, when I was a teenager, I told this girl, you wouldn't get so ticked off if it wasn't true, right? So, oh my gosh, if it's
Nice
true,
empathy there.
right? Exactly. I was 14, right? But it was an epiphany for me, and I turned it on myself, and I said, wait a minute. So, Greg, every time somebody criticizes you, trash talks you, the only way for it to work is that there's truth to it. So the issue is not them pointing it out. The issue is me resisting it. Right. So this one gal said, Dr. Greg, at the hospital, she's pushing my buttons. I'm like, well, uninstall your buttons. And what are the buttons? What are our buttons? The buttons are insecurities that you can do something or say something that's going to control my emotions. Why? So what do you do on insecurity is, if it's true, I own it. So I had the girls, like I said, okay, girls try and trigger me. They say, Dr. Greg, you have a big nose, your hair's thinning, you have a dad bod, and you're so ADHD extra. Right? Was that funny, Juliet? Right? Right. So then I responded with, girls, everything you said is 100% true. I own it. Now what? And they're like, nothing. Because it just, right, boom.
Right? Because yeah.
Once you own the truth, then the environment has no more power. So insecurity, it's either true and I don't want to own it. So the answer is to own it. Or we believe lies, like it's not true, but I believe it to be true. Right.
Right.
Or it can happen when somebody's gossiping. So it's really walking into the negative emotions are a doorway to something deeper that culminates in this. The issue is not what they think of you. The issue is what you think of you.
Yeah.
And right there it is, that if you need, like, hey, I need you to compliment me and validate me. Why? Because I don't think enough of myself to fill that myself. So I need you to fill that hole in me.
Right. And I can't do
Right.
that today. You have a dad, Bob. You already you
Exactly.
already
Right.
no,
Like,
I'm just
we can
joking.
talk about that offline, Greg. Right. But that's the issue. And that's why, so building your identity, value, and worth, right.
Uh-huh.
And figuring that out is so crucial. But that's honestly what it's exposing. It's, I don't need anybody to pursue me about. I want them to,
Hmm.
but I don't need them to. And
Right.
that's the key, right?
So what's the
Walk into
big
negative
oh,
emotions. Yep.
sorry, what's the biggest misconception you run across with those negative emotions? What are the biggest things that people think about negative emotions that surprise you?
Well, it doesn't surprise me because it's kind of natural to humanity ever since birth. Um, we frame negative emotions as number one, bad,
Hmm.
number two, to be avoided, and number three is that it's other people's responsibility to solve it.
Yes.
Right. So even as an infant, right, or a 2 year old who, like, can I have a sucker? No, you can't. They throw a temper tantrum. Right. So what do we do as parents? We say, not okay. So I understand your emotional goal, your pathway of expression is not okay. So what do we all do? Like, okay, that didn't work. So what is there a healthier way? Right. And then the 2 year old says, well, why do I want the sucker so bad? Why? Right. So it's literally, we already do this process throughout childhood. It's just something happens when we become teenagers and adults. We don't do the process anymore.
Uh-huh.
Right? We go right back to the environment, being the ones who are in charge of my emotional state. But it's a pretty, I mean, it's a very human thing, right? And I even talk about with identity and worth that we talk about children, like, where does that come from? We say if a child's coming from a hard home, that child has a low self-worth. We say that, right?
Uh-huh.
But what's the natural experience that every human being on the face of the earth ever has gone through? It's that if a child feels pursued by his or her parents, right? And that pursuit is, of course, unconditional love. The pursuit is honestly investing in helping us to recover from failure. Hey, get back on the horse, get back on the bike. It's okay. But also, that pursuit is equipping us to be successful in life.
Hmm.
That is the process, I believe God has set up. Why? Because every human being, there's not a human being that cannot go through that process, right? So basically, as a child and with our parents, that our value and worth is contingent upon our parents doing that. Well, then there's a whole spectrum of healthy versus unhealthy
Hmm.
parents. So then as we grow, because we've already been trained that my value and worth, like, I don't know what to think about myself. So my parents, right, start giving us formulas for how to interpret ourselves, interpret others. Well, then we get to the peer stage of adolescence, and that's where it starts really going off on others, meaning if I feel pursued and validated by my peers, oh, I'm popular, right? So my value and worth is high. Then it plays out with other contacts like teachers, bosses, coaches, boyfriends, girlfriends. It kind of culminates with our spouse. Hence the next book about iCubed for couples, going through the same process. Very, very natural process for every human being ever. And that's why I say that there has to be a conscious choice by the person to remove every other human being from that formula, because my identity and worth cannot be contingent upon other people pursuing me, or I'm going to live a miserable life.
Hmm.
Then I walk through, I'm getting to now that I walk through, how do you do that? How do you actually successfully move through it? So I say, when it comes to, I don't need them to pursue me, I want them to. It doesn't change the definition of relationship, right? It's still safety and pursuit. And it does not, like in marriage, does not change the standard. It does not change the expectations. What it changes is the degree of negative impact on me if it doesn't occur.
Right.
And right there is the answer. So it doesn't mean you get zero emotion, because, like, say with my wife, I can now objectively talk to her and say, hey, I'm not feeling pursued here, versus if it's my value and worth is tied to her pursuing me, my right now I'm in, trying to get into emotional salvation mode. I need you to, why aren't you like, right? Then we get our emotional and the inflation, right? So how do we decrease that to make it more objective? from need to want. So whenever that doesn't occur, it goes from devastating to just disappointing. Like I'm not devastated. Like I say, roll it, that principle I don't need, I only want, roll it all the way back to mom and dad. So people, even adults, just have this weight on them that, like, when's mom and dad going to own it? When are they going to apologize? Or when are they going to start being healthier emotionally? Right. And it
Yeah.
just weighs on them, even as adults. So I say, once you go through this process, I'm no longer devastated by my mom and dad and what they did. I'm disappointed
Hmm.
because why? I'm disappointed because they were not as healthy as they should have been as parents. But I'm an adult now. I'm in charge of my identity awareness, so I'm not devastated by it anymore. I'm just disappointed.
Right.
And that is where we should be, right? Having that
Yes.
removal where we control it.
So you're breaking a pattern here, and I'm just going to put this out because I'm sure people get into this work and then they take those steps to break a pattern. And a pattern doesn't just involve you, it's everyone else in the dynamic. So how do you respond to people who start to do the work and then the family, the toxicity unit really roars back because they've just changed the dynamic? How do you handle that and stay in integrity with what your goals are breaking that pattern and keep your sanity? Does that make sense?
So are you saying that once you start getting healthy
Yeah,
and
so
there's not
yes.
like this codependency among, right?
Yeah, so
Right. So,
let's say
yeah.
you're in this toxic relationship. I had this
Oh,
experience
right.
myself
Mm-hmm.
where dad and my daughter would push buttons because they were kind of aligned together. And one day they came to me and I was just like, I'm exhausted. I can't do this with you guys anymore. I'm going on a trip. See you. Bye-bye. And you guys solve it. You're perfectly capable. And that was the first time I never, tried to get involved. And
Yes.
the blowback I got was incredible. You don't care. You don't, there was that emotional manipulation to draw me back into that
Right.
toxic behavior.
Right. Okay. So that's like, we talk about like, codependency and stuff. So um, let me come at it from a principle that came from a book back in the 80s. It's called the battered wife syndrome, where
Oh,
the big question is, why do they keep going back to the abusers?
uh-huh.
And the principle that comes out of that book that applies to all of us is that we're much more committed to what's familiar than what's healthy. So logically, a wife who is trapped in there, obviously, if the husband is abusive, it's not just like the physical; it's like in all areas, like control the finances. So the leaving that situation produces more fear and anxiety
Hmm.
for the wife than staying in it. Same thing there, like with family, when we disrupt it because there's a family system, like it's based upon expectations. When I say this and do this, you respond this way. So when we start doing healthy, which means we set boundaries
Right.
of, hey, not okay, I'm not going to respond emotionally to that anymore. It's now a brand new world. It's unfamiliar and it rocks their world because they don't know how to respond now. So again, because their emotionality is contingent upon you, that's where they get angry and attack because they're trying to, I need you to come back to the expectations, even though it's unhealthy. So by setting those boundaries and start doing healthy, they have a choice to make. But yeah, initially there's going to be a lot of pushback and attacks, but that's kind of proof, right, that it's working. And it's also proof is like rational, healthy, wise, and right. Like I am not going to do something that's irrational, unhealthy, unwise, or wrong because you emotionally need me to.
Right.
Right. That's the whole thing is like, your emotional state's not contingent upon me. So I'm not going to say a lie by calling you a different gender when you're not. So I don't, right. So you need to work that out in yourself. And by
Hmm.
setting those boundaries, like you have a choice, right? I'm not going to do what's irrational, unhealthy, unwise, and wrong in order to make you feel better because it's crazy,
Yeah.
right? And that person has a choice. They
Yes.
either start doing rational, healthy, wise, and right, or they're going to continue to be in turmoil.
Yeah, no, that's true. I actually went on vacation, came back, and they had solved the problem. And it was like this
Right.
epiphany, like, oh, if I just be
Right.
quiet and don't engage,
Right.
they'll go solve it on their own, and I won't have that emotional turmoil. Because
Yeah.
I
And
would give them a solution and then they come back and yell at me about the solution.
right. So yeah, and that's perfect because you equip them, right? Which is what we need to do. So it's not like totally disengagement. But secondly, is when there's a quick win, right? Then it's like a quick win for them. It's like, oh, it worked. That starts breaking that pattern where it starts now forming into a new healthier pattern. So, but we need a quick win. So when you left and then came back and they solved it on their own, they say, oh, okay, so I can do this, right? So it's literally that's our influence in our control column, no control column. Our influence, just let's just keep doing rational, healthy, wise, and right. And they have to make a decision on a response. So there's a verse in the Bible, Romans 12, where it says, as much as depends upon you, live at peace with everyone, right? So control column, no control column. Hey, as much as depends upon you, it's always right to do right. It's always healthy to do healthy. You don't have control over them, but as much as depends upon you, that's where you're going to find your peace is do rational, healthy, wise, and right. And then they're going to respond how they're going to respond, right? But that's the beauty of those words. There's so much peace in doing that and so much turmoil in doing what's irrational, unhealthy, wrong, and unwise.
Yeah, absolutely. Greg, where can we find you and your book?
All right. So I would just say go to iCubedbook.com. It's automatically linked to my main website, becomingmore.com. But go to iCubedbook.com and you'll see the book and the information and stuff there. But if you go to Amazon, just search for my name. It's too hard to search for iCube, but just search for my name, Dr. Greg Stewart, and you'll find the book. But that's where you can find me. And of course, I'm all over social media too.
Oh, fantastic. He's on Instagram. He's doing a great job
Yeah.
on Instagram. So, Greg, thank you so much for being on today.
And thank you for having me, Juliet. Thank you so much.